Hi, everybody. I guess we'll get started. So it's CISC121 Week 3. I guess the topic of today's meeting is going to be loops. And there are also some announcements that I'll make. I'm also going to briefly talk about the assignment that was released on Monday. Monday or Tuesday? Anyway, it was released this week. Let's see. There is an assignment that came out this week. It's not very long, but you shouldn't leave it. You should start it relatively soon. In case you do run into any problems and you need to ask some questions, you want to avoid doing the assignments. You want to avoid starting the assignments 1 or 2 days before it's due. There's still some stuff I have to do on the OnQ site. Namely, I have to put up the forums. I keep on forgetting to do that, but I will do that soon. Yeah, and that's it. Does anybody have any questions about the course so far? Oh, there's a quiz next week as well. I think it's next week. It's going to cover the material in weeks 1 and 2, and maybe a little bit of list stuff that you're doing this week in week 3, but I'm not sure about that. I'll let you know in more detail when I decide if I'm going to cover week 3 or not. I'm hesitant to cover week 3 on the quiz because there's probably enough material in the first 2 weeks, especially for the students who haven't programmed before. What's going on here? Oh, something's going on. Just a second. Something funny is happening in Teams. Why do I have a 1? Oh, Cash, I think Cash has a question or a hand up.
Yeah, I just had a question regarding the quiz. So
yeah,
I don't know. I mean, it could be my system itself, but I'm still getting this notification that I have 1 quiz pending, and when I check the section for the quiz, it shows that everything is logged right now, and it will open on the February month. So
yeah.
I'm
I
still
don't know.
confused.
I got that warning too. It's supposed to be next week though, right?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I'm
I
just
don't.
confused. Did I miss a quiz or something or what?
Yeah, no, it's next week. I'm confused too. I don't know why the announcement's showing up, unless I have one of the quiz dates set wrong. So I'll go in and check that. Yeah, I saw that announcement. I got that announcement last
Okay,
night,
yeah. I just
and
wanted to check up with that. Yeah.
it scared me too. I was like, wait a minute. I don't remember there being a quiz this week. Who is this person?
Yeah.
Hey, just a second. Somebody. That's a very odd. Okay, never mind. I just had someone with the name Princess something waiting in the lobby. Okay. Yeah. Somebody else have another question?
I had a question. I just typed it in chat, but
I could just. Must we read 1.4, 1.5 to answer? No. So I don't. You mean the quiz? I'm unsure.
I'm talking about the assignment.
Oh, the assignment. 1.4. No, the assignment does not require 1.4. 1.4 is lists, which you're supposed to be reading this week. So I didn't ask any questions about that on the first.
Oh, really? Because I looked at the questions and I was sort of like, I don't recall any exercises in the textbook so far, like from sections 1.1, 1.2, 1.3 that would have used the methodology of switching the location of an element within a string, or like a character within a string. Because I'm thinking of the alphabet question you had, where you were changing around.
You don't need to. You don't need to switch anything in the string. So that question basically, I don't think the textbook told you about everything the string can do in Python. So the textbook doesn't tell you that a string is what's called a sequence in Python. But the assignment does explain, at the beginning of the assignment, there is some background information on Python strings that will let you do that question using simple indexing.
And by indexing, is that just what was explained at the beginning of the assignment, or is that?
Yeah, you need a loop, which I'm going to show you today, and you need.
Okay.
Do you even need to do indexing? Hang on, let me think about this. Yeah, you need indexing, but everything. I'm pretty sure I included all the information you need in the assignment.
Okay, I was just wondering because I quickly looked over it before bed last night, and I was sort of like, oh, none of the exercises or problems that I went through in the textbook actually dealt with that kind of process of swapping around data in a string.
There's no. Oh, you mean the one that wraps? Yeah.
Yes.
That one. I mean, technically, the textbook includes that information in section 1.4 when they talk about lists.
That's why I was wondering. I was like, oh, is that from?
But no, everything you need is in the assignment.
Okay.
Yeah. We love use concepts. Well, hang on.
I also have a question about the assignment. Would you like us to wait till after the lecture to ask or email you?
Yeah. Unless you want to ask it now, I can answer it quick. Is it quick?
No, I just know that a lot of people have specific questions, right? So I wanted to know if you want to do it after the lecture.
All right. Yeah, we should do it. Either. I mean, I don't have a lot of time after the lecture because I have another one at 1 hour after this lecture.
Okay, well, I can ask it quickly now. For the questions with the alphabet, a lot of it only works if you do uppercase, which kind of makes sense. But would you like it to make it more robust than that? Or is that okay?
I'm not worried about input validation or anything like that for this assignment. Okay. And the textbook doesn't care about it either because they save everything for when they start talking about functions.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, so we'll leave the input validation for a couple of weeks. Yeah.
Professor.
Yeah.
A quick question about the inputs for the assignment. So I finished it yesterday, and I noticed that you want us to take the inputs as command line arguments. Can we just use inputs instead? Like it's a lot easier than writing for command line. We need to use command line arguments.
You have to use command line argument. Yeah, it's actually not easier. So I'm going to show you how to do it.
Great.
Later today.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. For the assignment, we're allowed to use concepts outside of class if we have programmed before. I suppose, although I don't think you need to. I'm trying to think of what you would try to do. You're allowed to use concepts outside of class. Yeah, I mean, yes. No one's going to ding marks off of you if you do something that's not covered in sections 1.1 or 1.2 of the textbook. At least the TAs shouldn't. If they do, let me know. Okay? Can we? No, don't use NumPy. And you are supposed to use the math module. So I'm going to show you that as well today. All right. Any other questions? You shouldn't. You don't need to use NumPy for anything in this assignment. Anything else? Okay, that seems.
Oh, my last question is about style.
Sure.
So I know that in the assignment and on the website or the course page, you talk about just referencing the Jupyter notebook for style. I'm wondering if it's probably more appropriate to just bring it up with the TAs in terms of submitting our own programs we've been working on so far and just getting their input as to whether or not they perceive it as having or exemplifying good style.
You could ask them in office hours for sure. That would be appropriate.
Okay.
You shouldn't be worried too much about style in the first assignment. I mean, basically, as far as style goes in this assignment, you should pick, reasonable variable names. You should make sure there's one space around your operators. Use lowercase use lowercase letter. Make sure your variables start with lowercase letters. Unless you're naming constants and things like that. I mean, there's not a lot you have to worry about regarding style in this assignment.
Right. Okay.
Okay. All right. Let's get started. Loops. Hey. What? This is the. Oh no. This slide shouldn't be here. I'll get rid of that later. Okay. So if you're up with the readings, if you're keeping up with the readings, you'll have read about loops already. The textbook starts with a while loop. Which is fine, I guess. The while loop is, I guess, a little less common than a for loop in most, I guess, in general. But it does have its purposes. So if you haven't seen loops before, what you need to know is that a while loop, there's something called the body of the loop, which is the lines that are indented after the while part of the loop. right? So everything that's indented after a while, that's called the body. So the body of the loop runs as long as that condition there is true, right? And notice the note over here, right? If you've never programmed before, this is not, the stuff in orange is not Python. So don't write anything like that in your Python code. It won't work, right? So the stuff in orange and italics is just some plain English that's describing what needs to go there. Now, the funny thing with a while loop is that it relies on this condition, right? So while that condition is true, let the loop body run. So it's easy to make a while loop that never stops running, right? You can just make the condition true, right? And so this is an example of a while loop that will never end. And you can run that in idle or using Python, right? So there's the same program, right? If you run that from the command line, oh, wrong one, sorry. No, this is right. I closed everything here, okay. Shift. Sorry. Open, there we go. Python is infinite loop. Run forever, right? And so if you go back and look at the code, right, all this does is it adds one to I and then prints the value of I. And you can see it just keeps on going. If you ever end up in this situation, sorry, you just press Control C to stop it, or Command C in Mac. So you have to kill this one yourself, right? Otherwise, this program will run forever, or at least until you run out of memory or something like that. So you generally don't want a loop to run forever, right? So to prevent that loop from running forever, the body of the loop, right? Remember the stuff that's indented, right? Normally that contains code that causes the loop condition to eventually become false, right? So in other words, the loop condition here, right? Normally that involves a variable that the loop body changes, right? So this loop body changes the variable user input, right? And the condition looks at the variable user input. Right? And so all this program does is it prompts the user to enter a string. That's what this function input does. Right? So input, when you run it on a Python program that has a command prompt of some kind, will print that out onto the screen. And then it'll just sit there and wait for the user to type something and press enter. If you've never seen \n before, that means that's the new line character. And so I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so we can run this program too. The user input. So when we run this program, so the program, right? So the loop body starts to run because this condition is true, right? Is user input not equal to the letter Q? Well, it's equal to the empty string here. So user input is not equal to Q, right? So the empty string is not equal to Q. That's true. So the loop body runs, right? And so it just prints out enter a string followed by a new line, right? So there's your enter a string followed by the new line, and you can type something in, press enter. And then what happens is after you do that, it comes back, the loop comes back up to here and checks the loop condition again, right? So user input is now hello over here, right? So is hello not equal to Q? The answer is true, right? And so the loop body runs again, right? So stop, right? Okay, so the user input is now equal to stop, right? Is stop not equal to Q? Well, the answer is true. So the loop body runs again, right? Stop, please, right? Okay, so is user input not equal to Q? Well, please is not equal to Q. So the loop body runs again, right? And it'll keep on running until you type Q and press enter. Right. So for those of you who have never taken CISC121 and are only reading the textbook, this might be the first time you've seen input. That's what input does. Right. If you have a command prompt, it will let you, it'll prompt the user to type something in the command prompt. And when they press enter, it'll store whatever they typed into that variable there. Okay. Now, for the simple examples in the textbook and in most textbooks that are shown to new programmers, it's usually obvious when the loop will stop. But in real life, it's not always obvious how many times the while loop will run. Right, so that is, you can get a while loop and you're not sure if the loop ever stops. Right? And there's an example of this in the week 2 Jupyter notebook, so exercise 7. So if you haven't looked at the notebook yet, exercise 7 is here. Just let me make it a little bigger. So there's something called the collapse conjecture, which is easily implemented with a while loop. So the collapse conjecture says, we'll start with this value n, right? While n is not equal to 1, right? If n is odd, set n equal to 3n plus 1. Otherwise, set n equal to n divided by 2. Right? And the conjecture says that for any value of n that's bigger than 1, this thing will eventually stop. But you can see here, no one actually knows if this is true, right? And in fact, no one knows how many times this loop will run. Right? And so this is something that you can code up very easily in Python, right? Or any other programming language for that matter. So collapse is right here. Okay, now this is how so the textbook shows you how to do this. I'm showing you how to do it again. This is how you get input from the command line, right? To get input from the command line, all you do is you import the CISC module, right? And then the first command line argument after the program name is CISC argv1, right? And that comes in as a string, right? The collapse conjecture needs n as an int, right? So all you do is you convert the string to an int by calling what's called the int constructor. Right? So you write int round brackets and you take the string and stick it inside the round brackets, right? If that thing is a string, if that string is an integer value, this line will succeed. If it's not an integer value, it'll barf, right? So I can show you that right here. So if you write in something like ABC, you'll get some sort of error, right? That's fine for our purposes now. Right, so the conjecture says, well, n is not equal to 1, right? That's easy to write, right? If n is even, so I'm writing it a little differently than what's in the notebook. If n is equal, if n is even, divide n by 2 and store n in itself. Right, so you can write that as n / equals 2, or if you don't like that, n equals n divided by 2, right? And here I'm using int division because I know for a fact n is even here. So I know if I divide n by 2, I always get back an integer. I think there's some questions in the assignment. When would we know to use input? And everything for assignment 1 says use command line input, every question, right? It does not depend on how you want the program to accept the input from the user, right? The assignment specifically says use the command line arguments for every question.
Professor Ma, sorry to interrupt in between. I just had one quick question regarding the input, and I just wanted to get some guidance on that. So, for example, if I want to provide a string as an input, right? For example, if I type my name as Cash, right? So I would have to type convert it into a string using the str, right?
No. If you want CISC argv every so this is just a list.
Okay, yeah, it takes as a string, right? So
everything's
So I just wanted to know if I want to grab any letter from it, so I should directly analyze it as an array, like the one it's shown in the assignment.
You should analyze it as an array.
For example, like if I give my input as my name, that is Cash, right? So for example, for an input A, I have given Cash. So A0 will be K, A1 will be A, right? And following the same.
Okay, so there's what happens if you run that program by typing in the name.
Yeah, but I
cache.
just want to grab the first letter, so I just
Okay.
have to use.
So if you want
so
the first letter,
Yeah.
you now have to process
I have
the
to
string S, right? So
Okay,
if
yeah.
it's a string, you can write that.
Using the indexing, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So if you want to do that for whatever reason, you can do that,
Okay.
right? But the input comes in as
a string itself.
Now, the way the command line arguments work is the command line arguments are separated with a space or by one or more spaces, right? So this one actually has 3 command line arguments. That's cache.py is technically the first one. The second one is cache, and the third one is bash, right? So in this case, you can get that. So print S and then print T. Oh, hey, cache. That one has 2, right? And so on and so on and so on. Now, if you run this program with fewer than 2, it'll barf, right?
Okay.
Because there is no third argument, right?
Yeah.
If you run it with 3, everything's fine, but you can't get the third argument because you never asked for it. Now, if you want in Windows, if you put the input in double quotes, right?
Oh, so does it consider it as a one whole string?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's nice.
Right. So there you go. So if you have a space in your input, but you want to treat the whole thing as one thing, then you put it in double quotes in Windows. In Mac or Linux, you should probably use single quotes, although double quotes will work. It's just you have to be a little, well, I'm not going to worry about it. Double quotes will work, but it actually technically means something else. Okay.
All right. Yeah.
For question 3b, when working with the cipher, should we be using ASCII values? ASCII. I mean, you're only worried about the capital letters A through Z. Everything else, you can just, you don't bother transforming those. What is the benefit of command? So the big benefit of using a command line argument is it's much easier for the TAs to test than it is for using input, because I can write a script that will generate an arbitrary number of different inputs to your program, and then they can just run the script and they can look at the output. If they have to type in everything, it takes them forever to mark your assignments. The other benefit is there's almost no real program that works by having someone sit at a console and type in input one at a time, right? The only time you see this sort of thing is when it is in a course like CISC121 or CISC121 sometimes, depending on who teaches it, right? Where you actually try to get input from the user manually, where you prompt them for input. There's almost no real world program that works that way, right? Almost every other program, there's some sort of graphical user input or something like that, where you type things into boxes and stuff like that, right? Can you re-explain why well, I just re-explained it, I think, right? Again, yeah, so again, there's almost no program that you would ever use in real world, in real life, where you're sitting there typing things in on the command line. So far, I was using prompt user inputs with statement that says when inputs are needed. Yeah, sure. I mean, sure. But again, outside of an introductory programming course, you would never do that. Do we need? No, there's no input validation on this assignment. Right. So you can just assume that whoever is typing in command line arguments types in reasonable command lines.
Is it okay if I interject with a question here?
Sure.
So just because Cash brought up this small problem of a program that would take a command line argument and then basically spit out a certain character in that string based off what the program specifies. I'm just wondering, last week from Inica, I learned about splits.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that's just superficially similar, or if it's a more condensed way of, I guess, allocating or splitting, like, or allocating the string into separate components, if that makes sense.
I mean, if you want, so when you split a string, typically usually, so the programming problems that come up when you split a string, there's some character where you want to split the parts of the string at, right? So if you're processing like a English text, often you want to process each word of the text, so you would split at all the spaces or at all the punctuation marks, right?
Right.
That's typically how you'd use split. You could split on every character if you wanted to, but you don't have to do that in Python because a string is a sequence in Python. So you can just iterate over all the letters in the string one at a time.
Okay, and that we just using the
you just use a for loop, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Good. Where was I? Collabs. Right. We were in collabs. Okay, so we were way back here. Okay, hang on. Just find that again. Here we go. Okay, so I was talking about collabs. So if the number n is even, you just divide it by 2 and store it back in itself. If it's not even, right? So else, you multiply n by 3, add 1, and store it back in itself, right? And here I'm not going to do anything with the value n except print it. Right? And so this was an example of a while loop that it's not obvious will it stop, and it's also not obvious how many times will it run before it stops. Right? So if you run the program with 1, well, that stops, right? Because the loop never runs, right? So if you enter 1, is 1 not equal to 1? Well, the answer is false, right? 1 is 1, so the 1 not equal to 1 is false. So the loop body never runs and the program ends. If you run it with 2, right? Well, is 2 not equal to 1? The answer is yes, right? Is 2 even? The answer is yes. What's 2 divided by 2? It's 1, right? So when the loop comes back up again, is 1 not equal to 1? The answer is false, and the loop stops. So that stops. Right? 3 surprisingly goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The loop actually runs 7 times before it stops. Right? 4 runs twice. 5 runs 5 times. And if you just try small numbers, it seems that this thing always stops. But it doesn't take very long before the sequences start to become quite long. Right? You see 14 is already getting longer. 15, what about 99? Right? 101. And so on and so on and so on. Right? And it doesn't become long. You don't have to, there are relatively small numbers that cause this loop to run a surprising number of times. Right? And it's one of these mathematical curiosities that no one knows whether this thing will ever stop. Although the conjecture is that it will eventually stop. No one knows for sure if it will. So people have actually written basically this program and let it run for a very long time, right? Increasing n by 1 every time. I don't know what the maximum value is that someone has actually run this for, but it's probably in the Wikipedia article. If you look at the notebook, I think there's a link. Yeah, there's a link to it. So if you want to look at this, it probably tells you how far people have gotten before it stops. Right. Okay. Now, as I said at the beginning, while loops tend to be less common than the other type of loop in Python. right? So often when you have a computational problem, you know how many times the loop should run, right? If that's the case, then you should probably use what's called a for loop, right? So a for loop in Python runs once for every element of a sequence, right? And so I don't think the textbook tells you what a sequence is, but they're very important in Python. So a sequence in Python is just an ordered collection of values, right? So in other words, it's something called a collection, and a collection is something that lets you store more than one value, right? So far, the variables you've been using for ints and floats and strings, right? Each variable can hold one thing, right? A collection is a thing that can hold more than one value, right? So a string is a collection of characters, of individual characters, right? So the string ABC is a collection of the three characters A, B, and C, right? Now it's an ordered, so sequence is an ordered collection in Python, and ordered doesn't mean sorted, right? All it means is that there's a first value, there's a second value, there's a third value, and so on and so on and so on, right? So there's some sequence of values. That's why it's called a sequence, right? So Python strings are sequences. They're sequences of characters. The textbook uses range for the for loops, right? So a range is also a sequence, and typically it's a sequence of integer values in sorted order, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or something like that. Right. Now the body of a for loop, right? So again, everything that's indented after the for part of the for loop, right? That body runs once for each element of the sequence, right? So the loop body runs length sequence times, right? So if your sequence has 10 elements, the loop runs 10 times, right? If your sequence has 0 elements, the loop runs 0 times. And so typically how you typically when you use a for loop, you have some sequence that you want to loop over, right? So for example, you might want to do something with every character of a string, right? If you want to count, so often you have to count starting from 0 up to some number, right? Then you use a range as your sequence, right? And that's why the range class exists in Python, right? It's specifically meant to generate sequences generate arithmetic sequences. Right, so the loop body in a for loop runs once for every element in the sequence. So a string, right, A, B, C, D, E, right, that's the sequence of characters A, B, C, D, E, right? So there's 5 elements in that sequence. Right? So when you write a for loop, the way you write the for loop is for, right? And then you give a name, right? You pick some variable name for the element of the sequence that the loop is currently working with. Right? So for a string, the letter C or the name C is often used, right? The way you read this is for each character C in S, right? So for each character C in S, I can do something with the character C, right? So the first time this loop runs, the character C is A, right? The second time the loop runs, the variable C is B. The third time it runs, it's C, and then D, and then E. Looking at this loop, so if you've never seen a for loop before, what this loop does is it prints A, then it prints B, then it prints C. So it just prints each character of the string. Right, and so that is here. Right, so there's our little program. And so all it does, right, is it prints out the A, and then it prints out the B, then the C, then the D. Sorry, hang on, let me get this out of your way. Right, so it prints out each character of the string in order. Right, for strings, it goes from the front of the string to the end of the string. Okay, now the textbook quickly moves on to the notion of a nested loop. So that's a loop inside of a loop. One of the reasons it does this is because it never tells you that a string is a sequence, and it doesn't talk about lists until the next part, so chapter 1.4 of the textbook. So it's actually hard to come up with many interesting problems involving loops, where you're only using integers and floats, right? Typically, you need some sort of collection to loop over, right? So if you have a nested loop, it typically looks something like this, right? So you have one for loop, right, where you loop over one sequence. The body of the outer for loop is everything here, right? So that's the body of the for loop. So you might have some lines of code, right, in the body, and then inside the body you might have another for loop or a while loop, right? You can do that too, right? And the what we call the inner loop, right, is looping over another sequence, or possibly the same sequence. They can be the same sequence. That's not a problem, right? You can loop over another sequence, the same sequence. And this loop runs. Oh, there's an E missing. The inner loop runs that many, right? So the outer loop, this one here, runs that many. Oh, and there's an E missing here. Length sequence one time, right? So however long this sequence is, if there's 10 elements in this sequence, right, and there's 5 elements in this sequence, right? Every time this loop runs, right, this one here will run 5 times, right? So the inner loop runs 5 times every time the outer loop runs once. So if there's 10 elements in sequence 1 and 5 in sequence 2, then in total, this line right here runs 10 times 5 times, right? So 50 times. Whoops. Okay, so you might ask, so why do I want a nested loop, right? And so the answer is, well, it turns out you use them quite a lot. So here's an example of a simple question that you can answer with a nested loop, right? I want to print all the strings of length 2 that can be formed using the letters A, B, and C, right? So the way you do that is with a pair of loops, right? So starting with the letter A, right? What are the 2-letter strings that I can form, right? Well, I can use an A followed by an A, right? I can have an A followed by a B, and I can have an A followed by a C, right? And that's all of the 2 strings of length 2 that I can form starting with A, right? And now, how many strings starting with B can I form using only 2 characters? Well, I can start with B and then have an A, then I have a B, then a B, then a B, then a C, right? And then what about C? All the strings starting with C? Well, there's CA, CB, CC, right? And so the way you formulate this is with a pair of loops, right? So for each character C1 in S, right, I'm going to append to the end of C1 one of the characters in S, right? So how do I get another character in S? Well, I write another loop over the characters of S, right? So for each character C2 in S, right, I just take C1 and add C2 to the end, right? So that when this loop starts running, right, for C1 in S, right, the first time this loop runs, C1 is A, right? So here, that's always going to be A the first time the loop runs, right? Every time C2 runs, it's going to be A, B, then C, right? So that's A, and then A, that's A and B, that's A and C, right? And then you print out all those strings, right? When the inner loop finishes running, you come back out to the outer loop, right? So the second time the C1 loop runs, C1 is B, right? So it's B and A, then B, then B, then B and C, right? And when the body here finishes, it comes back up here, right? The third time the loop runs, C1 is C. So you get C and A, C and B, and C and C. And so that's the 2-letter program. So the program I'm running here looks a little differently. So I'm going to print out some extra information, so that you can see when each loop finishes running. Right? So when you run that, right, you get the A, the A, the A, the B, the A, the C, right? And then it tells you the loop 2 body ends, right? So this line runs, right? And so whenever the loop 2 body ends, the second character is C, right? Because loop 2 loops over the A, the B, and then the C, right? So the second time the outer loop runs, right? C1 is B. Oops, sorry. Right? That's a loop 2. That's loop 2, and that's loop 2. Right? And so the loop 2 body ends again. The third time the outer loop runs, right? C1 is C. Okay. That's loop 2, that's loop 2, that's loop 2. Right? So the loop 2 body ends. And then finally down here, the loop 1 body ends. Right? And the program stops. Sorry, what does the C in C1 and C2 mean? You mean the name C1? That's just the name for a variable. So when you iterate over a string, you're iterating over the characters, right? So typically you call it something like C or car. Can you call it car? I don't. Yeah, or car or something like that, right? So C1 is just the outer loop. C2 is just the variable for the inner loop. Right? That's all that's happening. Right. So when you write a loop, when you write a for loop, that's the variable. That's the name of the element that the loop is currently visiting. Right. So each time through the string S, C1 I have available to me C1. Right. So C1 is A the first time the loop runs. C1 is B the second time the loop runs. C1 is C the third time the loop runs. Right? Whatever you don't want to call this C, you don't want to call this C, right? So you don't want the same loop variable in both loops, right? Because you probably want because each loop you probably want the individual character from each loop in each loop. Okay, so that's a doubly nested loop. You can have a triply nested loop. Oh, sorry. How do we write our code so that it takes values from the command line? If X, Y, what is it? How do we write our code so that it takes values from the command line? So I'll answer that question after I finish this slide. Amy, what's the terminology for that type of literal? Which literal are you referring to again?
What I was referring to was the character 1, character 2, character 3. So that's like an assigned, like in Python language, that's written into the language as a designated literal, right? Like it only has that one meaning of when you're searching a sequence.
No, so that's not what a literal means. So a literal is a value that you can actually write in your program. So the number 1 is an int literal because you can write down the number 1. Right.
Okay.
The string ABC is a string literal ABC. Right. So C1 is a variable name. Is the name of a variable. That's all it is.
Oh, but it's already programmed into the language. You have to define it. The program's already, or Python's already defined it.
Sorry, it's not programmed into the language. I'm not sure what you mean by programmed into the language.
Well, because C1 always means character 1, C2.
No. It's just the name I picked.
It doesn't initialize it.
It does. Oh, you mean there's no initialize? Well, the for loop does the initialization for you, if that's what you're asking.
Then,
right.
Well, I'm asking because it's kind of playing off of what Foster was asking about here, because I think when I first saw the terminology of C1, C2, C3, or even like when you had the simpler program, it said for C1 and S, I thought that it was just referring to the first iteration of C in the string sequence.
No.
But
you can use whatever you want. So hang on. That's actually a good question, but That's a good question that you brought that up. Okay, so look, this thing here is just a variable, right? And you can name variables in Python almost whatever you want, right?
Right.
So I can call this X if I want, right? And I can call this Y if I want. And now this just becomes X and Y. And this runs the exact same way, right? It does the exact same thing.
So how come Python knows that that placeholder there is referring to a character in the sequence S?
That's how the for loop is defined. So the for loop is a Python construct, right? And the construct is defined such that that variable always takes on some value in that sequence.
Okay.
Yeah. So
the answer to your question is because that's just the way it works.
I might be able to, and maybe you can tell me if this is accurate or not. So every time it runs, X becomes the first element in the string.
No, X becomes the current.
Yeah, sorry, that's what I mean.
Yes.
That's what I mean.
Yes.
Like the first time it runs, it's the first element. The second time it runs, it's the second element.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering if there's like a trace for that I could kind of see how the data is moving around. Because you're saying that X in S for that first, the outside loop and it's running for the outside loop, is it running 6 iterations? Sorry,
no,
9.
The outside loop runs 3 times, right? So how many times does this loop run? It runs the number of elements in S. So it's always 3.
Okay, so we're doing, so it's A plus A, because the inside loop would then be the other 3 times. So it's A plus A, A plus B, A plus C, B plus A. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So the
okay, now I understand. For some reason, when you had the C1, C2, C3, I thought, oh, maybe that's like a designated thing in Python that's character in a sequence. Okay.
Yeah, it's just a variable name.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Python tutor allows you, you can, there's lots of ways you can trace your code, actually. I mean, the simplest way is just to print out everything, right? So here you can just print X. Right, and here you can just print Y. But the problem is when you do this, you now have to figure out what's going on, right? So typically what you end up doing is you end up writing something that looks like this. If you know how to use a formatted string, you probably want to do that, but not important for now. So you do something like that, and now you can see, right? So X is A, Y is A, right? The result is AA, right? Notice that X doesn't change here, right? It doesn't print out X again. So Y is B now, and then Y is C, right? And so you can see it that way. So that's another way to do it. You could set breakpoints here if you wanted to, and run it through the debugger, which I'll show you how to do, I guess, when we start to talk about functions, or you can look up how to do it. Right?
Okay, yeah, I've actually used this methodology yesterday to kind of analyze the movement of the data in a program.
This only works for simple stuff,
right?
As soon as you start to do anything complicated, it just becomes a mess, right? And then you need to resort to some other tool. Python tutor is probably okay for this. The debugger is okay, but the debugger is kind of clunky. But I can show you that some other time too. Okay, I guess I should. So for people who haven't programmed before, everything before loops that you learn in most programming languages, most students don't have too many issues with, right? So most students can do arithmetic. Most students can write simple if statements. But as soon as you ask them to start working with loops, that's where the wheels kind of fall off the cart, and everything kind of blows up. So it's actually pretty important that you work through the textbook and the notebook exercises for the loop stuff and make sure you understand how loops work. Because they more or less start to show up everywhere once you start working with lists and strings and other sequences. Right? Okay, the triply nested loop, right? That's what we're doing. So here's the triply nested loop. So you can now answer the question, how can I get all strings of length 3 using the letters A, B, and C? Right? It's the same logic. So I'm going to start with the letter A, and then how do I form all strings with the letters A, B, and C? Well, I can have an A, then an A, right? And then what? Well, I can put another A, right? Or I can do an AAB, AAC, right? And so that takes care of the cases where the first and second letters are A, right? And then I can change the second letter to a B, so ABA, ABB, ABC, right? And so that takes care of the case where the first letter is an A and the second letter is a B. And then you do the same thing for the second letter being a C, right? So ACA, ACB, ACC, right? If you are following along, you'll realize that the AAABAC, right? You can do that with 2 loops, right? To get the third letter, you just throw in another loop, right? And so now you've got 3 loops, right? Or a loop inside of a loop inside of a loop, right? And so that's the 3-letter one, which is here. Okay. And so Python, right? And you can see, and so if you run this and trace through, you can actually see what's going on. So it's a little uncommon to see a triply nested loop. And it's even less common to see 4 nested loops. And you almost never see anything beyond 4 nested loops. Because at that point in time, you're probably better off doing something else, where the something else basically involves writing a function, right? Which we will get to in a couple of weeks, right? Because most people have difficulty reasoning about anything beyond a doubly nested loop, right? And so you shouldn't be surprised if you also have trouble doing so. Right? But it's important. So it's really important that you can deal with a single loop, right? And you should also be able to reason about a doubly nested loop, right? And beyond that, you should probably, like I said, you should probably do something else. But I can't tell you what the something else is yet because we haven't gotten there. Okay, now back to this command line argument thing. That's fine. What was I going to do? Oh, the text. Oh, yeah, I was going to show you the assignment quickly. Okay, so assignment here. So all of the assignment questions ask you to do the following. Where is it? Your program. Where to go? Oh, this one doesn't actually say to do that. Oh yeah, yes. Right. So where they all say something like this. They ask you to solve some problem, and they want you to take the input from the command line, right? So in other words, they want you to be able to write something like this, right? When you run your program for the command prompt. Right. So for this program, which I've called print vals, it would be nice if you called this the same thing. I've noticed some people are already calling them like question 1, question 2, question 3, or something like that. It would be nice if you followed the assignment instructions and actually named it that. The way you do this is as follows. Sorry, I don't want that. I want. Okay. Right. So the way you start this out, so the way you start all your programs is by importing the CISC module, right? And the CISC module is the module that gives you access to the command line arguments, right? The way you get the command line arguments is using CISC argv, right? So CISC argv 1 is the first command line argument after the name of the program, right? So here it's asking you to use only one command line argument after the name of the program. That's the name of the program. That's the so technically this is the first command line argument. That's the second command line argument. right? So that CISC v1 is the second command line argument, right? If you want to break this down, right? Okay, so when you print S, all it does is it prints out whatever value you typed in after print vals.py, right? So that's 0.1, right? That thing there is always a string. Right? So a lot of the programs, I think, yeah, a lot of the programs ask you, require the input argument as either an int value or as a float value. Right? So print vals requires it as a float value. Right? I'm going to get rid of that because I don't want it. I don't want to actually print it. Right? So to convert your, hang on, let me do it this way. So to convert your command line argument from a string to a float, you use what's called the float constructor, right? In other words, you write float round bracket, and put the string inside, right? So I do float s, right? And I now have the float value 0.1, right? And now I can use x inside my program, right? For the first question, so that you need to write that formula. Basically, you need to evaluate the value of that formula, right? So I need 1 minus cos x divided by x squared. Obviously, for cosine, sine, that's the exponential. That's the square root, right? You need to use the math module to evaluate these functions, right? I mean, someone did email me asking me if you had to use if you could use the math library, right? And the answer is yes, because otherwise, how would you evaluate the cosine of x, right? I'm not expecting you to, work out the Taylor series for cosine and evaluate it that way, right? So you only use CISC-argv for assignments, not input. No, you use CISC-argv whenever you want a command line argument. That's what it's there for. CISC-argv gives you the command line arguments.
Okay, well, I think so. What he wanted to ask was like, can we use the input function for the assignments, right? Is like,
no,
is it
do
fine?
not use the input function for the assignment.
Okay, CISC, all right. Yeah.
Do not use input for the assignment. Right? Use the command line arguments because that's what the assignment asks you for. For our final assignment file, do you want us to keep in our checking like print statement? No, don't keep the print statements in and stuff like that, right? So don't print out extraneous information, right? Only print out what the question asks you to print out. Don't use write line. Well, you can use write line if you want to, but I think it's much easier just to use print. I mean, will we lose marks or not be marked on assignments? I mean,
I was just clarifying there that was I understand now with the input versus command line arguments. I just got confused because I thought at the beginning you had said that for the first assignment use inputs and then for the rest use the command line arguments. But
no.
now I understand what we have to do.
Okay. Will you lose marks? I mean, if the TAs have a hard, so if you have a whole bunch of print statements that's outputting stuff that the assignment doesn't ask for, then the TAs have to sift through all your extra stuff. So you're just making life hard for them. And if you make life hard for somebody, they might, I don't know what they're going to do to your mark, right? So we have a quiz next week. Yes, that means you have a quiz. Do you have a class? Well, yours is on Thursday, so we can have a lecture if you want. If you don't want one, that's fine too. I mean, it's kind of up to you guys if you wanna do this meeting or not. Okay. Right. Now, if you have some of them have 2 command line arguments. So the blood pressure one, you need 2 command line arguments, right? So for 2 command line arguments, right. So if you need 2 command line arguments, it's right, import sys and then I'm gonna bring them in one at a time. CISC RV1, right? So that's and the second one is going to be CISC RV2, right? Oh, sorry. Okay. These are both floats, so you have to convert them both to floats. If you haven't read the question yet, the first number is the systolic pressure, the second one is the diastolic pressure. So systolic equals, I have to convert the first one to a float, and then I have to convert the second one to a float. So that's how you would start the blood pressure question. And then the third one's a string, so you don't have to do any conversion. One of them's an int, right? Where's the int one? 3, no, this one is an int. The third one, you need an int as the command line argument. So, oops, sorry. So again, same thing, right? Import sys, get the first command line argument. Well, technically the second. And then convert it to an int. So, int. And away you go, right? The part 2, you need an int and then a string. So for part 2, oh, sorry, 1, 2, right? And then your string, which is your text message, right? So this one's a message, is just equal to T, and that's it. Away you go, right? And that's it, right? So, I mean, it's not hard to grab the command line arguments. Is there anywhere we can look to write the piecewise function? What do you mean look? You just need an if statement, right? Right. That's all the piecewise function is asking you for, right? If x is less than or equal to 0, y is 0. If x is between 0 and 1, it's that, and if otherwise it's 1. Right. So for that, you just write an if statement. Yeah. Good. For this one here, to evaluate e to the power something, there's a function called exp. Right. So that's the one you should use there. The function for square root is math.sqrt. Right. So math.exp and math.sqrt will get you those two. Okay. Oh, we're actually overtime. So, I mean, that's it for today. Any questions or any other questions?
Professor, yes. I just have one question for the one which you said for the exp one, right?
Yeah.
So instead of using the exp, can I just use math.e and then use the power function just to give the power minus x squared by 2?
Yeah, for this assignment, that's fine.
Yeah.
That's not the way, I mean,
that's just like the simplicity for the simplicity.
Is that the simplest way to do it? I mean, I don't think that's any simpler than calling the exp function. But most Python programs would call the exp function.
Okay, yeah.
For reasons that aren't important right now.
Yeah.
Mark, is there an issue with command line arguments mistaking? No. So for question 3, where you might have to, where you enter in a string, right? Just enter the command line arguments like that on Mac and like that on Windows. Right, and then it'll read in everything inside the quotes as a single argument. Right, that's it. Any other questions? Okay, I gotta go. I gotta prep for the next lecture. So I'll see you. Well, I mean, I'm gonna say that there'll be a meeting next week. I mean, as always, you can, if you can't make it, you can just watch the recording, okay? So they're all recorded. All right, thank you, everybody. I'll see you next week, or not.